For phase 4, this is Greg's follow-through after release of the ball. For the glenohumeral, he starts in flexion, and he ends with the right arm being in flexion and the left being in slight flexion. The movement is flexion. It is eccentric because he is slowing down, and he uses his pectoralis major, his teres major, his latissimus dorsi, and his posterior deltoid. For the scapulothoracic, his starting position is elevation, protraction, and upward rotation. His ending position is elevation, protraction, and upward rotation. The movement is elevation, protraction, and upward rotation. And the tension is eccentric. He uses upper and lower traps, the rhomboids, and the pectoralis minor. For the elbow, the starting position is extension. The ending position is flexion. The movement is flexion. The tension is eccentric, and he uses his triceps brachii and his anconeus. For the radial ulnar, he starts in anatomical position, ends in anatomical position. There is no movement. The tension is isometric, and he uses his supinator, bicep brachii, and brachioradialis. For the wrist, he starts with the left being in extension and the right being in flexion. The ending position is flexion. The movement is flexion. It is an eccentric movement, and he uses his extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, and extensor carpi ulnaris. For fingers, he starts with the left being in slight flexion and the right being in flexion, ends with the left being in slight flexion, right being in flexion. The movement is left is in slight flexion, right is in flexion. It's an eccentric movement, and he's using his extensor digitorum, his extensor indicus, his extensor digiti minimi, his extensor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis, and abductor pollicis longus. For his cervical spine, he starts in anatomical position, ends in extension. The movement is extension. It's an eccentric movement, and uses his bilateral sternocleidomastoid and bilateral erector spinae. For the lumbar spine, he starts in slight extension, goes to more extension. The movement is extension. It's an eccentric movement, and uses his bilateral transverse abdominal and his bilateral erector spinae. For the hip, he starts in left slight flexion, right and extension. Ending position for both is extension. Movement is extension. The tension is eccentric, and he uses his sartorius, pectineus, iliopsoas, rectus femoris, and tensor fasciae latae. For his knee, he starts in left slight flexion, right extension. He goes to left extension, right flexion. The movement is left extension, right flexion. The tension is eccentric, and the muscles used are the vastus lateralis, the vastus medialis, the vastus intermedius, and the rectus femoris for the right. And for the left, the bicep femoris, the semitendinosus, the semimembranosus, and the popliteus. For the ankle, he starts in left anatomical position and right plantar flexion, ends in left anatomical and right plantar flexion. There is no movement of the left, and for the right, there is plantar flexion. It is eccentric, and he uses the peroneus tetris, anterior tibialis, extensor digitorum longus, extensor hallucis longus. For his toes, he starts with left extension, right inflection. He ends in left extension, right flexion. The movement is left extension, right flexion. The tension is eccentric, and he uses for his left the flexor hallucis longus and the flexor digitorum longus, and for the right he uses the extensor digitorum longus, extensor digitorum brevis, extensor hallucis brevis, and extensor hallucis longus.